She walked into the glittering mansion that night, surrounded by chandeliers, laughter, and the scent of luxury. But while others were dressed to impress, she was singled out, judged not by her presence, but by the color of her skin. Instead of being treated as a guest, she was ordered to wash dishes, humiliated in front of people who saw her as nothing more than a servant. What none of them realized was that the truth of who she really was would turn their smug smiles into stunned silence. How could they have been so blind? The night had begun like any other evening of grandeur for the wealthy elite. The mansion stood tall on a hilltop, its windows glowing like fireflies against the dark sky. Expensive cars lined the driveway, their polished exteriors gleaming under the floodlights. Inside, the air was filled with music, laughter, and the scent of gourmet dishes carried on silver trays. For the guests who had gathered, it was another night of indulgence, a display of status and pride. But for one woman, it would become a night she would never forget. Her name was Amara. To anyone who met her, she radiated quiet strength, a woman whose presence commanded respect, even in silence. She had built her life on resilience, carrying herself with grace through challenges that would have broken others. On the surface, she blended in with the crowd that evening, dressed elegantly, her posture calm, her smile soft. But beneath that calm exterior was a woman who had seen the world in ways most of those guests never could imagine. Amara grew up knowing what it meant to be underestimated. She was the daughter of a teacher and a seamstress, raised in a modest neighborhood, where dreams often felt too heavy to carry. From an early age, she learned how people's perceptions of her skin color shaped their assumptions about her worth. At school, she was often overlooked. At stores, followed by suspicious eyes. Yet, instead of bitterness, she carried those wounds as lessons, building a strength that made her unshakable. Years later, that same determination would carry her into a life of stability and success. She had married a man who, like her, believed in hard work and perseverance. Together, they built not just a home, but a life filled with pride, love, and quiet triumphs. Their wealth was not inherited. It was earned through years of sacrifice and dedication. And the mansion where the party was being held that night, it wasn't just any mansion. It was theirs. But the guests didn't know that. They saw a black woman stepping into a world they assumed didn't belong to her. They saw her not as an equal, but as someone who must have been there to serve, to pour their drinks or clear their plates. And from the moment she entered the room, the whispers started. A glance here, a smirk there. Amara noticed, of course. She always noticed. Years of experience had sharpened her senses to detect the quiet dismissals, the subtle signs of exclusion that others might overlook. Yet she didn't flinch. She carried herself with dignity, moving through the room as if every corner belonged to her, because it did. But the tragedy of prejudice is that dignity often goes unseen. And on that night, surrounded by diamonds, silk gowns, and tailored suits, Amara found herself the target of a kind of humiliation she hadn't expected to face in her own home. What made the moment more painful was the contrast. The laughter of the guests filled the air, each toast echoing with self-congratulation. They saw themselves as refined, cultured, and above reproach. Yet beneath the surface, their actions revealed something raw and ugly. They didn't see Amara as a guest at all. They saw her as an outsider. And before long, their assumptions would turn into actions that exposed just how deep their prejudice ran. For Amara, this wasn't just about a party. It wasn't about one night of disrespect. It was about every moment in her life that had prepared her for this kind of cruelty. Every time she was told she didn't belong. Every time her success was questioned. Every time her presence was treated as a threat. The sting of those moments lingered within her, and as the night unfolded, it would all come rushing back. What no one in that glittering room realized was that Amara's silence was not weakness. It was restraint. And restraint, when pushed too far, has a breaking point. That evening would soon spiral into an encounter that none of those guests could have imagined. A clash between perception and truth. A collision between arrogance and dignity. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just change how they saw Amara. It would expose the very foundation of their prejudice. But before that moment of revelation, Amara would endure something that struck at the very heart of her humanity, something that turned a night of celebration into a night of cruelty. And it would all begin with a simple, devastating assumption: that she was there to serve. The night pressed forward, and the mansion glowed brighter with each passing hour. Glasses clinked, laughter rippled, and conversations spilled over the polished marble floors. Yet for Amara, every sound seemed sharper, every stare heavier. She had walked into the party with quiet confidence, but that confidence was now being chipped away, one glance, one smirk, one whispered word at a time. It began subtly. A woman in a glittering gown brushed past her, muttering under her breath, as though Amara had stepped into her space. A man glanced at her empty hands and raised his brows, waiting as if she should be carrying a tray of champagne. The slights were small, but they built like layers of ice, pressing harder against her chest. She had been in rooms like this before, but never as invisible, never as underestimated as she felt in her own home. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A guest, his voice laced with authority and entitlement, tapped her shoulder. He didn't greet her, didn't ask her name. Instead, he thrust an empty glass into her hand and motioned toward the kitchen. The command was wordless but unmistakable. "Take this, clean this. You don't belong here among us." Amara froze, the weight of the glass in her palm colder than ice. Her instinct screamed to push back, to announce who she was. But her silence wasn't fear, it was calculation. She knew all too well how quickly these situations could spiral, how a single word of defiance from her could be twisted into arrogance or hostility. So she held her ground, chest tight, heart pounding, and waited. But the humiliation didn't stop there. Soon, another guest called her over with a flick of the wrist, waving toward a spilled drink on the table. When she didn't move, the woman's tone cut through the music. Sharp, dismissive, dripping with disgust. "Don't just stand there. Clean it up." The words pierced her like a blade. Around her, conversations slowed, eyes shifted, whispers grew. A few laughed quietly, watching as though the scene were entertainment. Amara felt the heat of their judgment, the crushing weight of being seen not as herself, but as the stereotype they had decided she was. Every insult, every order carried echoes of the past. She remembered the times she had been followed in stores, the moments when her ideas were dismissed in meetings, the way strangers clutched their purses tighter when she walked by. Those memories weren't just scars, they were reminders that, in moments like this, she wasn't being seen as a woman or a guest or even a human being. She was being seen as less. And yet, Amara remained still. Her silence screamed louder than any argument could. But that silence was tested again when one guest, emboldened by the laughter of others, shoved a stack of dirty plates into her hands. The porcelain clattered together, threatening to break, and with it, her restraint. She could feel her composure unraveling, thread by thread, as the weight of those plates pressed against her arms. The kitchen door loomed ahead, a symbol of everything they expected her to be. To them, it wasn't her home. It was a place she should serve in, unseen, unacknowledged. And as she stood there, balancing the weight, something inside her shifted. The tension in the room grew thicker. Some guests avoided her gaze entirely, unwilling to confront the cruelty they were complicit in. Others smirked, reveling in her discomfort. The humiliation was no longer subtle, it was a spectacle, and still, no one questioned it. No one stopped it. Her chest ached with the familiar burn of injustice. She thought of her mother, who had worked her hands raw to provide for the family, and of her grandmother, who had endured far worse in times when speaking up came with unbearable consequences. Generations of silence echoed within her, and she felt the weight of their endurance pressing against her own breaking point. Every step she took with those plates felt heavier than the last. She could feel the tension mounting inside her body, each insult replaying in her head, each whisper growing louder, and beneath it all, a quiet truth pulsed. They think I don't belong here, but this place, this house, this wealth, this life, belongs to me more than it ever will to them. The laughter behind her rang louder, filling the air with cruelty disguised as celebration. Amara reached the kitchen doorway, but before stepping inside, she paused. The decision she made in that moment would define the night, not just for her, but for everyone watching. Would she stay silent, carry their weight, and disappear into the background as they expected? Or would she stand in the fullness of who she was, forcing them to confront the truth they refused to see? The plates trembled in her hands, and with them, the suspense of the entire room. The night was far from over. The humiliation had reached its peak, but the revelation was still to come. And when it did, it would shatter every assumption, every prejudice, every smug smile that had stained the evening. What they didn't know was that Amara was no servant. She was the mistress of the house. And soon, the truth would strike harder than any insult ever could. The plates in Amara's hands felt heavier than stone, her arms straining not from their weight, but from the weight of humiliation pressed upon her. The laughter behind her was no longer background noise. It was a chorus of cruelty, echoing through the mansion she called home. Every smirk, every order, every dismissal had led to this moment. She had endured silently, but silence has limits, and Amara had reached hers. She turned slowly, the stack of dishes still trembling in her hands. The guests, wrapped in silk and arrogance, barely noticed at first. To them, she was invisible until they needed her. But when she stopped walking, when she refused to vanish into the kitchen as they expected, their laughter faltered. A few eyes turned toward her, confused then impatient, waiting for her to fall back into the role they had forced upon her. But Amara didn't move. The music in the background seemed distant now, a hollow rhythm compared to the pounding of her heart. She looked across the room, her gaze steady, unflinching, and with a calmness that felt almost supernatural, she set the plates down on a nearby table. The clatter rang out like thunder, cutting through the air, pulling every gaze toward her. The room went silent. For the first time that evening, she wasn't being ignored. She wasn't background. Every eye was on her. But instead of shrinking beneath their stares, she stood taller. She let them look. She let them feel the weight of their own assumptions pressing back at them. Then, with deliberate grace, she reached into her clutch and pulled out a single key. Polished, gleaming, unmistakable. She raised it slightly, and though she didn't utter a word, the message was deafening. This wasn't just any key. This was the master key to the house, her house. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A man near the bar shifted uncomfortably. A woman clutched her necklace. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of realization, the kind that claws at your chest, forcing you to confront the ugliness you'd rather hide. But the reveal wasn't over. The massive double doors at the end of the hall opened, and in stepped her husband. He carried himself with quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to be announced. Conversations always softened when he entered a room, but tonight, the silence had already settled, thick and suffocating. His eyes scanned the scene, taking in the frozen stares, the plates abandoned on the table, and finally, his wife standing tall in the center of it all. He didn't need to ask what happened. He could see it. He could feel it. And without a word, he walked to her side, slipping his hand gently into hers. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it was everything. It was confirmation. It was power. It was the truth. None of them could escape now. The guests looked on, their faces pale beneath the glow of the chandeliers. The man who had shoved a glass into Amara's hand earlier shifted from foot to foot, his confidence drained. The woman who had barked at her to clean a spill avoided her eyes entirely, staring instead at the floor as though it might swallow her whole. Every smirk that had stained the night had vanished, replaced by shame, guilt, and something else they would never admit: fear. Amara's husband lifted his chin and addressed the room, his voice steady but sharp, each word a blade. He spoke not of wealth, not of ownership, not even of the insult itself. Instead, he spoke of dignity, of respect, of humanity. His words weren't loud, but they cut deeper than any shout could. The guests squirmed in their designer suits and gowns, the weight of their hypocrisy pressing down on them like chains. But Amara didn't need his words to validate her. She had already spoken without speaking, revealed without revealing. By standing her ground, by refusing to bow to their cruelty, she had shifted the power entirely. The humiliation they intended for her had turned back on them, magnified by their own arrogance. The room felt colder now, the glittering lights harsher, the champagne less sweet. Guests who once strutted with confidence now stood small, their wealth and status stripped bare against the truth that they had been blind. They had mocked, dismissed, and degraded the very woman who owned the space they so proudly flaunted themselves in. And yet, Amara didn't gloat. She didn't sneer or revel in their discomfort. She simply stood with dignity, her hand in her husband's, her silence louder than any rebuke could ever be. In that silence, the weight of the night crushed every person who had dared to look down on her, because the truth was undeniable now. The woman they had tried to humiliate was the one who held the keys, the one who commanded the space, the one whose life and accomplishments towered over their shallow pretenses. And in that moment, the mansion no longer glittered with wealth. It burned with the heat of exposed prejudice, the kind that no luxury could disguise. What none of them realized was that this night would haunt them, not because of the grandeur of the party, but because of the lesson they had been forced to learn, a lesson they could never escape. Amara had endured the worst of their cruelty, but she had also claimed her power. And the silence that followed wasn't just theirs, it was hers. Because silence, in her hands, was no longer submission. It was victory. The silence that followed was unlike any other silence Amara had ever experienced. It wasn't peaceful and it wasn't empty. It was the heavy silence of guilt, of shame, of realization crashing down like a storm on every person in that glittering hall. The music still played faintly in the background, but no one danced. No one laughed. The chandeliers still shimmered above, but their brilliance felt hollow now, unable to distract from the truth that had just been laid bare. Amara stood tall, her hand still resting in her husband's, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to call anyone out by name. Every person in that room already knew exactly what they had done, and what it revealed about them. Slowly, the guests began to retreat. A few muttered half-hearted apologies, their words stumbling out as though rehearsed, lacking sincerity. Others avoided eye contact altogether, their shame too heavy to confront. The arrogance with which they had entered the mansion had evaporated, replaced with the unmistakable weight of being exposed. They had shown the world who they truly were, not through words, but through actions. And now, there was no erasing it. But for Amara, the impact went deeper than just this one night. It was not the first time she had faced prejudice, and sadly, she knew it would not be the last. Yet this moment was different. It wasn't a stranger in a store, or a passerby on the street, or a quiet dismissal in a workplace. This happened in her own home, in the very place where she should have been safest, most respected, most seen. And that reality cut sharper than any insult. Still, she refused to let their cruelty define her. Instead, she carried herself with the same grace she had walked in with. But now, that grace was matched with power. She looked at the same faces that had mocked her and saw them shrink beneath her gaze. She had no need to belittle them, no need to strip them of dignity the way they had tried to strip hers. Her silence was enough. Her presence was enough. Her truth was enough. As the last guests slipped out into the night, the house grew quiet. The music stopped, the lights dimmed, and only the sound of Amara's steady breathing filled the grand hall. She turned to her husband, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and pride. Sorrow for what she had endured, but pride in how she had risen above it. Together, they stood in the very space that had moments before been tainted with arrogance and prejudice. And they reclaimed it in that quiet, Amara reflected, not just on the cruelty of the evening, but on the larger truth it revealed. Racism, she knew, was not always shouted from the rooftops. Sometimes it was whispered in a crowded room. Sometimes it was hidden behind polite smiles, masked by wealth and sophistication. Sometimes it appeared as an assumption, a command, a laugh at another's expense. And yet, in every form it was corrosive. It stripped away dignity, humanity, and respect. That night, Amara realized something profound. No matter how much success she achieved, No matter how many walls she broke down, there would always be those who tried to put her back in a box. But she also realized something even more powerful. She would never let them succeed. Her story wasn't just her own. It was the story of countless others who had been underestimated, dismissed, or humiliated simply because of the color of their skin. It was the story of people who had to fight twice as hard to be seen as equals, of people whose silence had been mistaken for weakness, but who carried inside them a strength that could not be broken. And perhaps, for some of the guests who left that night, the experience would linger. Perhaps it would make them confront the prejudices they had ignored for so long. Perhaps it would remind them that the assumptions they made so carelessly could reveal more about themselves than about the people they targeted. Perhaps. But even if it didn't, Amara knew she had made her stand, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with dignity. And that was a victory no one could take away. Because the truth is, moments like these aren't just about one woman at one party. They are about a system of assumptions and prejudices that ripple far beyond one mansion, one city, or one night. They are about the countless invisible battles fought every single day by people who are judged not for who they are, but for how they look. And so, as Amara finally walked upstairs to her bedroom, leaving the empty hall behind, she carried with her not the bitterness of the night, but the strength of it. She knew the fight was far from over. She knew there would be more moments, more slights, more humiliations. But she also knew this. Each time she would rise. Each time she would claim her place. Each time she would remind the world that she belonged. And now, the question lingers, not just for those guests, but for us. How many times have we been silent witnesses to prejudice? Too comfortable to speak, too afraid to act? How many times have we allowed assumptions to go unchallenged, laughter to disguise cruelty, silence to mask injustice? And how many more times will it take before we finally choose to stand? Because Amara's story is not just her story, it is our story. It is a mirror, reflecting the uncomfortable truth we often try to ignore. And it demands that we ask ourselves, when the next moment comes, when prejudice stands before us cloaked in laughter or entitlement, will we stay silent? Or will we too rise,